Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Thursday night Anam Cara Meditation program. Just such an honor to be able to share this time with you and be in your virtual company. Not entirely satisfying. You know, when we get together, it's so great to be able to see everybody and, greet everybody as they're coming and give everybody a hug. And it might be a long time before we get to do that. But please know that in my heart I hold you all, and you're so dear to me, and this is such a sacred time on these evenings to be able to get together and dive into the practices and dive into the living presence of the divine that's within each and every one of us, and is the entire reason for doing practices, so that we can really become immersed in that direct awareness moment by moment, day by day. So thank you all for coming and bringing your practices, the strength of your commitment to this gathering this evening. Yeah, in a moment or two, we're going to be starting with the opening mantras. And the opening mantras as a practice are an invocation of what our true nature is. And tonight, because it's the first Thursday night of the month, we do a talk that's particularly focused on practice, dharma, and getting more deeply into some of those aspects. But we'll start with the opening mantras, so you're welcome to chant along. And also keeping that awareness that mantra is a throb of the infinite. It's a throb of our highest nature. And in a sense, the infinite has taken this sound form to be able to kind of reach into the domain where our ordinary mind and our body and our life exists, so that it can draw us back home to what our true nature is. And through mantra, we're both invoking that and also able to come to rest in that. So at the end of the opening mantras, we'll just sit in the stillness for a few moments to just enjoy what the mantra opens up, as it sets aside the mind and the day and the week and just opens that spaciousness of simply being and being fully present. So here we'll begin. Shri Mata Kali Devi Ki Jai Gajananam Bhuta Ganari Sevitam Kapita Jambu Palachar Bhakshanam Umasutam Shokam Vinashakarakam Namami Vigneshwara Parapankajam Shri Lanishaya Namaha Shri Lanishaya Namaha Shri Lanishaya Namaha. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Shri Mata Kali Devi Ki Jai. So once again, namaste, good evening, and welcome everybody. I welcome you with all my heart to this evening's program. And so tonight we focus on dharma and the practices, but with it, as we examine that and look at what's the understanding, there are so many practices, so many different traditions. And one of the things that we try to do with the Anam Cara Meditation Foundation is to be able to present and understand how the practices really overlap across the different traditions and how they're all aimed at taking us beyond the mind into the heart of our being, into the living presence of what our boundless nature is. And so with that kind of understanding, that's how we want to be able to look at the various kinds of practices. So this is a poem from the book Kali's Bazaar. It's called The Wise Know. See, the wise know these three to be separate: wants, needs, and love. By reducing their wants and needs, love fills the spaciousness of their being. They want only the end of suffering and the fullness of joy for all beings. They need only that which enables them to fulfill their dharma. They love with abandon all creation. This is what it means to be wise. This is what it means to be truly human. Animals, even insects, fight over territory, possessions, and mates, kill each other for food, and are constantly wary of attack. What makes you different? What makes you different? Distinguish yourself from these suffering life forms. You have a precious human birth. What are you doing with it? What are you doing with it? Do you know you'll have a human birth the next time? This is a rare gift. See, any creature can be angry, hurtful, fearful, greedy, but you can be compassionate, loving, kind, patient, and free. The world cries out for your humanity, your wisdom, your grace. You are Tara, you are Kuan Yin, you are Mary, you are Jesus, you are Krishna, you are Buddha, you are Kali, Tatwamasi, thou art that. Drop your masks, drop your delusions, right now. That's what the practices are about. Coming into that now. We're running out of time. Who can say when our last breath will be? No one. The mind always imagines, I've got more time, I've got more time, I've got more time. I remember my Guru Muktananda used to say, practice, practice, practice. Practice when you're young. When you're old, your body's going to be falling apart. It's going to be a distraction. So I would say, practice, practice. So all the practices are about coming into that wisdom that is the very nature of who and what we are. It's coming home to that self. So when we talk about the power of mantra and the practice of mantra, it's because mantra serves as a vehicle for coming home to ourself. And we start with where the mind is. And one of the insights that especially comes out of the Kashmir Shaivite tradition is understanding the different kinds of means that go with the different kinds of places the mind gets stuck. And by means, I mean the means of practice. In Sanskrit, it's upayas. And there are upayas, or means, for when we're really caught in a dualistic kind of mind. We're really just enmeshed with life, the suffering, the joys, the pains, whatever. And then, if we're going to practice, we can't do a kind of practice that's aimed at the mere dissolution into the infinite because we're right on the edge of that. No, we're on the edge of, dealing with all the stuff of life. We have to be able to move the mind and our consciousness along a bit. And so even when you look at a practice like mantra, there are different levels of which we do it. When we're saying mantra out loud, when we're chanting mantra, even when we're repeating mantra in the mind, that's called anavapaya. That's a practice that's aimed at, okay, there's me, the mantra, I'm trying to change my state, how do I do this? Oh, mantra is a good practice. The same could be spoken about in terms of using the breath. So practices, for the most part, for most people, that's where we start engaging. It's like, okay, these things seem very different. We can read all kinds of texts and philosophy saying we're all one, and it's all Shiva, it's all Tara, it's all this, all that. But if I'm sitting stuck with my mind and identified with this thought, that thought, the next feeling, whatever's coming on, that truth is not accessible. So the practices are aimed at being able to say, right where you are, that's where you engage the practice. And so as you engage, for instance, mantra, if we're doing Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya, then over time, that physical sort of gross level of practice begins to really inform the mind. And now the mind starts to become more immersed in that awareness of Om Namah Shivaya, with the awareness of I am Shiva, I am the auspicious one, I am that boundless one. But it's still a practice. The mind is now joining in that practice. It's holding that understanding, it's holding that awareness. That's called Shaktupaya. That's another level of effort. That's another category of means for helping to transform the mind. And so when Buddha, for instance, was talking about, watch your thoughts with care. As you think, so you become. He's talking about that level of practice. Because even though that's not the highest level of, yes, you are Buddha and you're not the mind at all, we want the mind to reflect the truth. And so we do practices that both transform the mind and begin to really immerse it in this highest truth. So for instance, last week when we were doing the Heart Sutra, or we were doing and going through the mantras from the Nirvana Shatakam, and also looking at Ashtavakra Samhita from Advaita Vedanta, those are all practices that are both on an Anavopaya level, you're reading, you're studying, you're thinking. It's on a Shaktupaya level, the mind, where you're trying to grasp it and go, oh yeah, I am that, I am that. I'm going to keep running that truth through my mind to help transform it so that it doesn't automatically fall into the awareness, oh, I'm just this guy, I'm just doing these things, all the little ways it identifies with limitation of awareness, limitation of being moment by moment. So Shaktupaya is a huge category for being able to engage the mind in practice with the idea that, yes, they're still thoughts, but some thoughts are more reflective of the truth than others. So it's called Shuddha Vidya, a pure thought would be, for instance, I am that, or Hamsa, or Aham Brahmasmi, I am the boundless one, or Tattvamasi, thou art that. These are still thoughts, but they point towards the truth. Other thoughts point towards ignorance. And ignorance means being bound by the mind, but also then driven by what's created by ignorance. Ignorance of ourself, ignorance of the fullness of our true being, ignorance of our divine nature, ignorance of the divine nature of all beings, puts us in such a state of lack, want, need, that we wind up living our lives constantly trying to fill the hole left by that ignorance. And so that's why the various traditions, Buddhist, yogic, other spiritual traditions, say that, well, to get really free of suffering isn't about having enough to satisfy your wants and needs. It's about getting free of what's the very identity, the limited identity, the ignorance of our true nature that created that black hole of wants and needs, and then drives people to exploit the world, exploit the resources, exploit other people, all in their attempts to be able to satisfy those needs. So it's a radical level of freedom. It's a radical level of transformation. It's so radical that in that fullness of being, then what do we need? What do we want? We have an entire culture and economic system based on selling people what they don't want or need, but convincing them that they do, and then manufacturing it, selling it, somebody making a profit off it, and yet the real needs for health care and compassion and love and kindness and support and upliftment, these fall by the wayside. So ignorance gives birth to all these levels of suffering and all the ways that humanity flails around ignorantly trying to fulfill that emptiness, when the truth is, in stillness, in silence, we can experience a fullness that goes beyond anything the mind could ever imagine possessing in 1,000 lifetimes. So the practices keep bringing us back to that the truth is, you're this extraordinary divine presence, fullness, ineffable, unquantifiable, unimaginable, but directly knowable. Directly knowable. And that also is the key behind the practices, is that as we move through the different upayas, the different means and levels, we're getting closer and closer to the direct experience. Because these yogic and Buddhist and other systems are really aimed at, we need to have that direct experience for ourselves. It's not enough to read about it in a textbook or hear that some great sage or saint had it, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. We need to know that and experience that directly here and now. And that's really what these great teachers and sages and saints have bequeathed to us, is the means, the practices, the upayas, for being able to enter directly that state so that we can know it for ourselves. And of course, that's what Buddha talked about. His lament was that he couldn't just give it away, and instead he dedicated the whole rest of his life trying to teach the means by which people can realize that for themselves, to really come to know the truth of their own sublime nature, and then walk that into the world. Because that's where the boundless compassion comes from. That's where boundless patience, kindness, love, wisdom comes from. It doesn't come from something the mind can posture at. So when the mind tries to posture at that, well, it falls apart pretty quickly. As soon as it's challenged, as soon as it's pushed, as soon as life gives it, some tough things to deal with, it can suddenly wind up falling back into its old patterns. So our practices are aimed at coming back over and over until we've so drenched the mind in the wisdom, and so drenched our being in the stillness and the silence, where we're just flooded by that direct knowing, that then we can reside in that space with what's called steady wisdom. Not intermittent, not just here and there. That's why the practices build towards steady wisdom, so that we can come and own that and live from that space and bring it in to everything moment by moment. And it's that, when we're entering that state, that's where it becomes clear then that there's a practice that says, okay, if you're caught in the mind, work on transforming the mind. Because as you think, so you become. Well, it's the nature of the mind to become whatever is arising in the mind. A thought comes up, I'm that thought. A feeling comes up, I'm that feeling. That's a habit of mind, to become what appears in its consciousness. So we become content, moment by moment. We keep becoming content. And that's why in Advaita Vedanta we'll say, who are you? Who are you? Who are you now? What have you become in this moment? Because moment by moment we're becoming something. And that's why the question is always answered with neti neti, not this, not this. You're not this limited thing, not that limited thing, not this, not that. And then when you keep saying that, you start to open the field of awareness to directly experience that. That what illuminates each one of those thoughts, each one of those feelings, each sensation in the body, the identities that we inhabit, the roles that we play, what illuminates all that? Well, what illuminates that is awareness. These are things rising in this exquisite field of self-luminous awareness. That's what we want to come to know. We want to shift our attention away from content to the awareness itself, to that luminous light of consciousness. It's illuminating everything, every moment. Doesn't matter, we could be in the most desperate of feelings and situations. That consciousness is there illuminating that. If we could let go of the content and shift, we would immediately begin to get some relief. immediately begin to come back to the truth of who and what we are, beyond the mind, beyond the body. So all the practices are aimed at coming home to that direct awareness. And from that state, then being able to see all that's unfolding within that field of consciousness. So when we're talking about the different upayas, a lot of the practices you can understand that way. Many of the practices, hatha yoga, the yamas and the niyamas in Ashtanga yoga, these are all anavopaya practices. We're in a state of separation and difference. How do I take care of my body? How do I take care of my mind? If I breathe in certain ways and do certain pranayama, it'll help to calm the body. It'll help to calm the mind. If I come back to a certain focus, if I practice imagining in a way of my favorite form, divine form. It might be a deity, it might be Kali, it might be Parvati, it might be Shiva, it might be Christ, it might be any number of forms. So the different traditions will talk about that. That too is a practice for helping us, because the mind likes form, to go from the form into the formless. So we start with these different forms that are very attractive, and what's attractive to you might be different from what's attractive to somebody else. So many different forms of the divine. They're all going to serve that purpose of serving as a way of taking our attention, and then we work with attention to dissolve the boundary of there's that other thing, that other form, that other being, Shiva, Shakti, whatever it might be, and me. We begin to dissolve that. Now, I am that. I am that. So whether it's in Tara practices or other practices in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, where there's different forms, it's called deity yoga, where you're focusing your attention on these different divine forms, but with the awareness of I am that. You become what you're invoking. You're becoming what the source of the mantra is. You're becoming that and realizing that in all its fullness. That's what then takes us beyond the ordinary mind and its identification, and in a way we're using the habit of the mind to identify with things, only now we're going to say, here, identify with the truth. Identify with the fullness of being. Identify with what so enriches you that you'll know that you have an inexhaustible supply of patience, of kindness, of love, of wisdom, that we can come into that and bring that into the moment, bring that into our lives, bring that into the world. So it's making use of habits of mind and saying, now we want to elevate it. We want to bring it up to the truth, the highest truth of who and what you are, so we can live in that truth, so that you can know that you are Kuan Yin, you are Tara, you are Buddha, you are Kali, you are Shiva. I am that is the underlying principle. And when we start to see that that's what informs these different practices, then we can appreciate. Some traditions follow, a particular set of practices, but they may be very similar to another tradition that just gives a different image to it, a different language to it. But the underlying dynamic of how it's working with the field of consciousness, the habit of mind to become identified with content, and our consciousness getting fused with that content, so that we have to defuse it so we can reclaim the fullness of our being, reclaim the expansiveness, really the infinitude of being. That's what all the practices are aimed at drawing us to. And through that, then we can see, okay, yes, there's times when we need to do a concrete practice. Compassion's not arising spontaneously because I'm not in touch with that part of my infinite nature in the moment. So let me train the mind. Let me train the mind to recognize that when somebody's annoying, they're in a state of suffering. They're in an afflicted state, is the language we might use in the Buddhist kind of context. That the afflicted mind gets caught and identified with limitations and then creates suffering for itself and others. So to put that into practice means that when we see people flailing about in different ways, to have compassion for them. And that can be any number of different kinds of ways that people do that. We might be watching the news and seeing something on the news, and it's horrible. And we can get so angry about it. And that's the mind's reaction. We can understand that. But there's a larger picture that we can also be aware of that allows us to see that, oh, people out of their suffering, they flail about in these horrible ways and create even more pain, even torture and death for others. That's coming out of this terribly afflicted state that they're in. Right? So the practice and understanding begins to also inform and allow us to look at the world in a different way. It also begins as we get more immersed in the practices and come into the fullness and the stillness and the quiet of deep meditation to begin with, that direct experience of what this sublime loving embrace is that holds all beings. And that is the truth and the essential nature of everyone at all times, in all places. That we can start to see that and understand that the suffering that we're creating for ourselves, the suffering that we're creating for others, that others are doing the same out of, is coming out of the ignorance of knowing that. So that we have to come back and do the practices that open the door to that. And some of the practices are really, they're not, technical. That's why in this poem from Kali's Bazaar, the greatest practice is compassion. The greatest discipline is patience. The greatest path is love. Resolve to faithfully and enthusiastically follow these, and you will know yourself to be free. So compassion, patience, love. Think of the discipline it takes to have patience with so many things in the world. Think of the discipline, the practice it takes to unfold compassion in the moment. Compassion means we recognize the suffering of others, that we can relate to it because we suffer ourselves. And the root of all suffering is the same for everybody. It may look different. Somebody suffering one disease may look different from somebody suffering another disease. Somebody suffering from one form of ignorance may look different from another form of ignorance. But the root ignorance is not knowing the truth of who we are. And knowing that, and knowing the relief that comes when we come to settle back into ourselves, that gives us the compassion to say, in this moment, that person is suffering from that. Now, how can I be present with that? May not be anything you can do to change their awareness in the moment. They may not be interested, not seeking, not questioning, not wanting to know. But you can hold that presence and that awareness in yourself. And that makes a difference. That makes a difference. Because now you're bringing the fullness of your being. You're bringing the loving presence of your true nature into that moment. And that's one of the most powerful things that we can do moment by moment, is to be able to hold that awareness and live it into the world. And so the practices are all about both transforming the mind and our awareness so that we can hold that steady wisdom, and then bringing it into the world in the natural course of our life. Doesn't mean we have to necessarily do anything special or different. Just by being the fullness of who you are, being in your divine, sublime nature, is going to transform everything around you. So coming back to the practices over and over, and as the practices get more subtle, we were talking about some of these as Shaktupayas, using the mind, so actively engaging the mind to say, I am that. I am the one. I am Shiva. I am that consciousness. I am the Buddha nature. I am the divine. That starts out as that kind of thought process, but as we go deeper and deeper with that into meditation, the mind becomes quieter and quieter. We start with, identifying with the mantra. I am the mantra. Then the mantra becomes just an awareness, not even a sound, not even a thought form, just a throb of awareness. Just a throb of awareness, awareness of being. That awareness of being to begin with, still has a sense of limitation about it. I'm not the infinite being, but I'm starting to get a sense of being that's free of all the content of the mind. I'm just being there, aware as a witness. Right? So consciousness is getting more refined, even the consciousness of the mind, so that it can come to rest right in that quiet, quiet space. Resting in that space of stillness. Now there's no more doing. See, the upaya, the next upaya above Shaktupaya, that's so sort of doing on a mental level, is Shambhavupaya. And Shambhavupaya is really a means that has nothing to do. You rest in the stillness. You're in such a subtle, still, quiet spaciousness of awareness that to do something even on a mental level would be too gross of a movement, too gross of a practice. It would disturb that sublime stillness. So as you come to rest there, it's more and more nothing, nothing, do nothing, be nothing, and then you're just simply absorbed. The infinite. It feels like the embrace of the divine. You're just taken into that. So nothing to do. And that's what the practices are all aiming at. From where we start off with doing something that is an Anavupaya or Bedupaya, the practices when we're really in a separate dualistic state, Hatha Yoga, mantra out loud, chanting, trying to invoke things, those are all on that level. Then we're absorbing the mind more and more, getting closer to that sense of I am that. And then finally, it's just the stillness. It's just the stillness. It's that infinite spaciousness in that stillness that dissolves the last of any boundaries that seem to exist between you and your divine nature, between you and all that is, between you and the boundless love that holds everything in its embrace. Now there's where we come into the fullness of knowing, the fullness of being. That's what we walk into the world. That's what the wise know. That's what we're called upon to make use of this life, this human birth, to come to that realization and bring that into the world in whatever context we do that is. You know, we all have different works and callings and jobs and relationships. All of that exists in that divine embrace. All of that is a presence that we live, that love, that direct knowing into. So let your mind return to its original nature as mind, pure consciousness. Everything else will find its rightful place and assume its rightful size in your life. This boundless mind embraces all. This boundless mind is boundless heart. Know this and know the love that embraces all. So it's all about getting our mind into a state where we can directly experience that boundless love. That is the source of mind itself. That is the source of consciousness. That's what holds everything in its embrace. So knowing that then informs our practices moment by moment. And the practices we want to do with that attitude as well, with love. You know, I remember Baba Muktananda saying, all sadhanas, all practices without love are nothing but hard labor. So it's also a practice to bring that loving attention, that loving care to sitting to meditate, to doing mantra, to chanting, to serving others. That we can remember, oh, this is a practice of the heart. This is not just a principle I'm trying to follow. This is the practice of the heart. And this is particularly important. You know, that's what I was talking about a little bit last week when you see the difference between some of the texts, like the the Heart Sutra and the Ashtavakra Samhita, even the Ravana Shatakam, that they're an expression of the logos, the archetype sort of the principle of knowing through thought and mind. And that's very different than, for instance, when you get into Tara practices or Kali, where there's this love, this embrace, this walking in the world, this bringing that in. It's all about that love. And that's what we especially need now, because it's love that makes connectedness. It's love that makes relatedness. It's the loving embrace that invites us into that sublime union. So coming back to love, and especially at a time when this world is in such desperate need of it, the earth itself needs love and respect. The people of the earth need love and respect. The species across the planet need love and respect. Even the plants need love and respect. There's nothing that doesn't need love and respect. And yet we spin out on the mind. And that's part of also what the imbalance that has happened through, following just principles of, we can exploit this, we can exploit the environment, we can just extract one thing after another, as if we were unrelated from it, as if we weren't a part of nature, as if the whole fabric of nature, of which we are an integral part, wasn't going to be frayed by what we were doing. But that abstraction is ridiculous. It's through that relatedness, our coming to know our total interdependence with everything. There's nothing that's separate from us. And so our actions have an impact on everything. So that growing wisdom, that reclaiming the feminine, the divine feminine, that's inherent in everyone, not just women, men as well. And the need to be able to access that function of relatedness, of connectedness, of love. And so we also want to keep that in our minds when we're looking at doing practices. Because the very word practice, the very word discipline, doesn't necessarily invoke love for people. And so remember, it's a loving practice. It's a loving discipline. It's out of love that we want to know this, and with great compassion and the boundlessness of that love, bring it into the world. So remembering that one of the greatest practices is love. One of the greatest practices is compassion. One of the greatest practices is that kind of patience and kindness. These are also all in relationship. So bringing us into relationship is also along the path of the upayas. Because first we start out of very disconnected, then we come into loving relationship, and then we come into union. So we come into union with the infinite, and in the infinite we discover that encompasses all beings, all of creation. It's all ourself. There is no other. There is no other. You are that. Tatvam asi. That's what the practices are aimed at. And that's why, in a sense, we can say, if you take what the Buddha and Christ said, and all the great yogis, saints and sages, the mystics and lovers of God, it can be reduced to 2 words. Choose love. There is nothing higher than love, nothing purer, nothing more selfless, nothing more powerful. And it is present in every moment. So choose love in all times, in all places. Choose love, for love has already chosen you. You are already, right here, right now, in that loving embrace. It's waking up to that. It's waking up to that. You are resting in the divine embrace, the loving embrace of the infinite. When we go into the stillness of meditation, that's where we first begin to discover it. Because our habit of identifying with the mind and getting caught in all the content, in the stillness of silence, that habit, that veil of thoughts disappears. And then the truth. You are in that embrace. right here, right now. All times, all places. And the only thing between you and knowing that is the mind and our identification with it. That's why all the traditions say that's the root ignorance. Not knowing the fullness of that love, of that boundlessness of being, that intimate connection with all that is as our very self. As our very self. Not something I have to like and appreciate. No, as my very self. That's what these are aimed at knowing. Beyond anything the mind can actually imagine. You hold it all beings, all creation. The sun, the moon, the stars, the galaxies, the infinitude, dark matter, light matter, all rest within your being, all held in that embrace. All that can be known by dissolving into meditation. Or just dissolve. Nothing but love. Not somebody experiencing love, not even an experiencer is left. Nothing. Light suffused with love. Boundless field of light. That's who you are. That's what we're called to know. That's why the great sages and saints said having a human birth is such a gift, because it's a form in which we can come to know that directly. Knowing that, we can live that. Living that, we walk it into the world. We walk it into the world, we transform the world. This is our calling. This is our dharma. This is our practice. It's coming to know the fullness of who you are. And the poor mind is relieved. It doesn't have to try and generate compassion when it's feeling, angry and irritable. You rest in your boundless compassion. It doesn't have to generate, good feelings towards something. No, because you are that. And it's all held in that divine embrace. Including the mind, including the limited mind. The mind doesn't just disappear. The mind is there. We're not caught in its net. And that's what gives us the strength, the compassion, the resilience to be present in the world with all its suffering and to see beyond it. To see beyond it. That's what gives us the strength. Because to just look at all the suffering and to think that there's nothing more than just that crushes the mind. So we need the clarity of vision to know the truth of who we are and the truth of what all beings are, and to be able to hold that from having known it directly, from seeing it reflected in the words of sages and saints who have also known it. This is directly knowable, not by mind, by consciousness, the power of consciousness. That's what this is. In the yoga tradition, that's talked about as kundalini, this boundless consciousness that frees our awareness from the confines of the mind. It's that consciousness that we want awakened, unfolded, fully present as our very self. And so we take refuge in the practices in order to come home to our own self, so that we can then bring that into this world. And so we're going to be chanting the Maha Mantras, the great mantras. Again, as a vehicle for being able to do that, we'll be chanting Om Namah Shivaya and Om Kali Ma, Kali Durga, Namo Namaha. A slow meditative chant. And really the chants and the mantras, they're like a love song. Right? This the love of the infinite reaching out to its finite creation and saying, here, come back home. Know your infinitude. Know that you are in my embrace. You can know that. You are fully loved, completely loved. You are completely lovable. You are completely embraced. Every cell in your body, every atom in your body is a throb of that love. To know that, we practice. To know that directly, we dissolve into that. Because that's who you are. That's your true nature. And never let anybody tell you any otherwise. You are the divine. And so we'll use the practices to come home to the truth of who we are. So we'll chant, and then we'll meditate. Chant with the awareness, I am that. I am the boundless one, boundlessly loving. Everything is in my embrace. I live in that. That's the truth.
Shivaya.
Durga Namo Namah. Kali Durga Namo Namah. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. Shivaya Namah. Shivaya Namah. Om Kali Ma. Om Kali Ma. Kali Durga Namo Namah. Kali Durga Namo Namah. So resting in the inner sound of the mantra, letting it carry you into the stillness, the silence, the language of love, the silence, the loving embrace of the infinite in silence. That's where you come to rest. That's who you are. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Kali Ma. Rest in the divine embrace. So we end with this prayer. And may all our practices truly benefit everyone, and may all beings know complete freedom from suffering. Namaste. So coming home to the truth, your own pure, sublime nature, opens your eyes, opens our consciousness, opens our awareness to be able to see the truth of what the real nature is of all beings, of all creation, to be able to experience directly that unity consciousness, and be able to cut through the ignorance, that root ignorance, and all that it gives birth to. There's a great author, her name is Riane Eisler, and she talks about the shift that happened from ancient cultures where the feminine was really more in charge, and as the patriarchal male-dominated modes of being came into our cultures, this notion of what she describes as dominator mode. This looking at things of how they can be dominated, exploited, again, all coming out of the ignorance of knowing the truth of who and what we are. And that has become so widespread and so imbalanced in our world that's part of what we have to be able to transform, both in ourselves and in the world around us. And transform by coming back to the wisdom, to the direct knowing of our intimate connection with all that is. So intimate, we are one with it. We are one with it. There is no other. To know that you are the divine that embraces all, that is all, that has become all. And to live from that place. Then how can we do harm to another being? There is no other being. How can we do harm to this planet? There is nothing separate from ourselves. So being able to come into that consciousness, that's the flowering of all the practices, of all the dharmas, all done with that loving awareness that we want to come home to that truth that embraces all, that embraces everything about ourselves and everything about all beings. To know that there's never a time, there's never a place when you're not in God's loving embrace. That direct experience is what unfolds through the practices, done lovingly, done enthusiastically, done with delight, done with joy. See, we relate to our practices as well. Are we going to relate through the mind? Are we going to relate through the heart? So connect even to the practices through your heart so that they really feed you and uplift you, support you as you walk in the world. Bring that wisdom, bring that love, bring that connectivity. So we're coming to a close now, and I want to thank you all for coming here this evening and sharing your sublime nature with our gathering and walking it into the world in all the ways that you do as you do your practices in everyday life. This is the time where practices need to be lived in the world, not just off in monasteries or caves or someplace else. In the world, That's where transformation is going to happen, and you're the one doing that by bringing the living practices and the living presence into the world. So with all my heart, I'm so grateful for all that you're doing. I'm grateful for the different ways that people are supporting Anam Cara by sharing our YouTube channel, sharing the e-newsletter, making donations. These all allow us to do this seva, this service of being able to support as much as we can people living in the truth of who and what they are and bringing that into this world at such a time it's so desperately needed. So with all my heart and with all my love, I thank you for being with us this evening. And I look forward to being with you again next Thursday night. Namaste.